So, who are all these people here? Who are these people?
They're monologuers.
What are they doing here?
They're doing their monologues.
What about?
Well, about whatever they want to do their monologues about.
I mean, all alone here on this stage?
Yes.
That sounds like a scary proposition.
It is.
Well, then why are they doing it?
Because they're very brave.
Brave? It doesn't take more than that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, it's scary. I can't understand why they're doing it. It's scary.
Because they love doing it.
Well, if they love doing it, maybe we should cut to the chase and have them do it. What do you think?
You're on.
All right.
They're on.
I have to read a few announcements there. Boilerplate announcements, and then we'll get on with the show. As long as I can read this sheet. Okay, welcome to the Willis Community Theater, of course. First of all, we want to shout out thanks to our sponsors, the Willits Furniture Center and Les Schwab. For 11 years, they've been supporting us, and it's important we support them. Without their support, it would be hard to pull this whole thing together. Upcoming shows. Cell phones, and thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the evening. Speakeasy IV. Let's get on with the show.
It all began, innocently enough, when I saw a note in the Willits News announcing auditions soon to come to the coast for a big Hollywood movie starring Jim Carrey, the recently deceased Martin Landau, and a couple of young ingenues I'd never heard of. Titled The Majestic, the producers were looking for a couple of hundred extras, or the term I prefer, background artiste, who were to portray residents of a small town in America circa 1945, 1955. The movie actually was a strategic move by Mr. Carrey, who was trying to transition at the time from being a really brilliant comic actor to becoming a tall, dark, and handsome romantic leading man. We're going to see how that works out. So I take the girls over to the coast, the Pinecone Motel, my two daughters, on a drizzly morning. And the audition was remarkably simple. They take your picture and ask only one question. Why do you want to be in this movie? Well, I said, I haven't had my 15 minutes of fame yet. So I get hired, the girls don't, and filming starts. The best part of it is that we get a real up-close and personal look at how a big Hollywood production actually gets made. And a lot of it is fascinating. For example, did you know they can alter the lighting on a shot to portray any time of that day or night that their director wants the shot to be in? We got to learn what these hordes of people milling about the set before every shot, what they actually do. There's makeup people that are crimping hair and faces. There's wardrobe people that are straightening neckties and cutting loose threads. There's gaffers and best boys hauling equipment hither and yon. You even learn a new vocabulary. These words echo across the set before every shot, from the director to the assistant directors and on out to the periphery. Rolling sound, stand by, and my personal favorite, action. Well, the truth is that a lot of times on a movie set, life is intensely boring, crushingly boring, because you stand around for hours and hours and hours sometimes while the director is reshooting the same scene over and over until he gets what he wants. It might take a day or two to actually film a scene that in the finished product takes up 1 or 2 minutes. But hey, the sun is shining, you're well fed, well hydrated, and you're getting minimum wage. So what's not to like? My moment of fame came on the last day, shooting the final scene of the movie, where Jim is returning to his hometown to reunite with his childhood sweetheart. We are packed, well over 150 of us artistes, occupying every inch, shoulder to shoulder, of the skunk train platform in Fort Bragg. We're instructed to make merry, be joyous, because the prodigal son is returning home to our booming welcome. So Jim alights from the train, as I'm standing there thinking, damn, nobody is going to pick me out because I have the random misfortune to be stuck in the middle of this huge mob of people, right smack in the middle. So Jim walks into the crowd. And as he comes in, the crowd separates in its turn, and they're giving him backslaps and huzzahs and welcome home. And I see this camera on a crane platform 20, 25 feet up in the air, filming the entire panorama. Then a really weird thing happens. I notice that Jim doesn't stop moving into the crowd. In fact, he seems to be heading right to me. Whoa, I'm feeling like I'm in some sort of fevered, insane dream. He doesn't stop until he gets right up to my right shoulder, and he gazes into the eyes of his co-star, whom I had totally failed to notice standing next to me for 20 minutes. So focused was I on that train pulling in. So I'm standing there, my mouth is parched, my heart is pounding, my lips are in an ear-to-ear frozen grin so intense, it's making my jaw hurt. So Jim moves in for the embrace with his beloved, and I see out of the corner of my eye the camera on its platform descending silently, ever so slowly, but coming closer and closer and closer, focusing on our three magnificent heads, mine and my two co-stars. God, I say to myself, let them reshoot this a dozen times. I am available. Well, they don't. And my career as a background artiste abruptly ends. The movie comes out Christmas 2001 and soon arrives at the Milieu Theater, where the manager, Junior England at the time, tells me I can bring my girls in to watch the last 5 minutes of any of the showings. Frankly, I think they were a little bored after the 5th or 6th viewing. But I certainly wasn't. And Junior actually gave me a frame from the print that he actually cut out and gave it to me for the family archives. And if you don't believe me, I want you to take a look at the really cute young guy wearing this very same gray fedora standing next to his new best friend, Jimbo. Well, the movie bombs. It gets a less than rousing 23% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. One critic goes so far as to say the movie is, quote, ponderous and overlong, dripping with fake sentimentality. The Village Voice critic sadly says the movie, quote, marks a steep downturn in Carey's career. But do I care? I got my 15 minutes of fame. You can rent my face anytime you want on Netflix. Autographs? Anyone?
I decided to write about my father because I wanted to spend some more time with him again. But which story to tell? I picked one that is silly and sad and very dear to my heart. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Edward Burns had dark curly hair, hazel eyes, dimples, and eyebrows that didn't quit. He was sharp and funny and so fast. Joe was an orphan by the time he was 5. At the orphanage, the nuns separated him from his big sisters, and there they all stayed for a year before finally being adopted by their mean old scary Aunt Sate. Now, I think this early trauma had him looking for love in all the wrong places. Joe was a Marine, and could he swear? Blue clouds of invective would fill the air. So funny. And for some reason, he got tickled if I swore right back at him. He was a decorated fighter pilot, war hero, my hero. We adored each other. Thick as thieves, the pair of us. Well, He looked for love in just one too many places, and my mother left him. He remarried, married Joe. It was a confusing and unhappy time. Soon everyone, 9 kids between the 2 families, and 1 adult, my mother, left that little town in Indiana. Joe and herself stayed. I dreaded visiting them. My jaws were clenched the entire time. But I needed to see my father. We found peace with each other, which meant we never acknowledged any trouble or wrongdoing. I suppose it would have been more honest if we had, but getting too personal was not our way, and it would have completely changed our relationship. I inherited from him those Irish blinders. Only seeing what suits you. Mary Jo was younger than Daddy, but she passed away first, just shy of their 24th anniversary. It wasn't until after she died and my father lost his touchstone that we realized how much trouble he was in. Whether she was protecting him or just couldn't handle it, she hadn't told us about the drastic changes in his personality or his memory problems. He had covered so well with that brilliant mind of his. I took him to the neurologist. The verdict was Alzheimer's. A gruesome sentence. Sometimes he would realize about his dementia and he wanted to die. He stopped eating. He couldn't live on his own. Assisted living depressed him. It was awful for him. So, because he had stopped eating, he eventually had to be moved to a skilled nursing facility. Dennis and I moved too, back to Indiana to look after him. Now, one thing that disease never touched was his sweet tooth. And sweets he would eat. So I brought him cookies every day. One day I walked in the room. He felt different. Stillness. He was somewhere, but he wasn't there. I stood looking at him. He was so changed. Not my big old Marine anymore. Except for those amazing eyebrows, still thick and black, though the hair on his head was silver. But under them, those once bright eyes, no twinkle. I just went on. I fixed the cookies nice on the plate and poured the milk in the good dunking glass. I tucked the napkin under his chin and put the cookies right in front of him. He took no notice. I said, Joe, eat your cookies. Nothing. Daddy, here, eat your cookies. Still nothing. Daddy, eat your fucking cookies! He started to laugh. Really laugh. Oh, precious moment, there was my father. He was chuckling like he used to with his shoulders. And we were laughing together. I happened to glance out into the hallway and was met by a sea of horrified faces. And all I could hear was the lingering echo of fucking cookies, fucking cookies. Their shocked eyes accusing me. How could you be so cruel to that helpless old man? How could I explain that I knew that if anything would bring him around, me using that particular word would do it. Those good people wouldn't get that. They didn't know Joe. Even if they did, they wouldn't believe it. But I knew him, and he was eating and enjoying his fucking cookies.
we go back in time and remember an event, what is it that we remember? What actually happened? That is what God saw, or something else? I bring it up because for many years, 58 years in fact, I've gone back many times and revisited an event that happened when I was 20 years old, 1959, working in a mental hospital outside Boston. McLean Hospital, where doctors, lawyers, professionals, and other well-heeled white people were kept under lock and key. I was a psychiatric technician, so-called, a fancy name for an orderly or an aide. On the particular day in question, I went into work, and the nurse I reported to said, "Today you're going to take a particular patient into town, have dinner with him. We're going to see if he's ready to re-enter that world out there." His name was Paul. We went through his file. There was nothing remarkable about it. She gave me some money for dinner, and she said to me, "Whatever you do, don't let him out of your sight." And so along about 5 o'clock, I went over to the ward where he was kept, got him out. He was happy as a clam to join me. We went down, took the bus into Boston. We went to a restaurant, sat down, ordered dinner. When the waitress said, "Would you like to drink?" I started to say, no, nothing. He said, "A big Narragansett and 2 shots of Jack Daniels." And the moment he said it, I'm thinking, 2 shots of Jack Daniels, that doesn't sound right. And when the waitress brought the drinks and set them down, he said, "Hang on," and he upended his Narragansett and handed it to her for a refill. And I said to myself, that's it on the booze. But no. After he finished that round, he did one of these things to the waitress before I could get to her, and she brought over another round. And I said to him, "Paul, we can't do any more of this. That has to stop." And he mumbled something, but then he did again, one of these things, where it was happening way over there, and I had no chance to intercept the waitress. And so when she brought the 3rd round, I said, "That's it, no more, bring us a bill." After he finished his drinks, we finished our food, we went out, and I was happy to be heading back for the hospital before things got out of control. But what I didn't know was things were already out of control. He headed the other way, and I followed him on a 2.5-hour walk up and down the hills of Boston. I didn't know where we were going. But after about 2.5 hours, it was pitch black, we ended up in Scully Square, a destination for sailors, drunks, prostitutes, college kids drinking on the weekend, whatever. And on the far side of Scully Square was the Old Howard, a burlesque house, then starring Justa Dream, her name in bright lights, and a scantily clad photograph of her affixed to a billboard outside the hall. And I could see as we were crossing Scully Square that that's where he was headed. And so I said to myself, well, this is it has to stop. And I reached out to put my hand on his shoulder, about to say something like, "Come on, we have to go." And 2 seconds later, we were rolling around the ground, grappling like wrestlers, rolling over and over and over, with the crowd hooting and hollering, "Come on, let's see some action here." And around and around and around, and it went on for, several centuries, it seemed like. And when I finally came to a stop, I thought, is that it? But no, it wasn't it, because moments later, the 2 of us, still clutched together, were airborne, and went flying through the air and came down on a bunch of people in the back of the paddy wagon that cruised Scully Square at night looking for people just like us. And when the paddy wagon was full, it went over to the station house, and they processed us in really quickly. And when I got up to the front desk, I tried to say to the guy something about, "I'm the good guy, and I am the hospital," and blah, blah, blah. But 2 minutes later, I was sitting alone in a cell, wondering what the hell was going on and what I was going to do. And so about 2 hours later, the jailer opened the door, and I went out, and there stood 2 beefy guys from the hospital with a straitjacket. Not for me, for Paul. And we went down to his cell where he was, and he wouldn't come, so we had to use the straitjacket, hustle him out to a hospital waiting car. Back to the hospital, they took Paul off to his ward, and I went to report the evening's events to the head nurse that had sent me on this mission. And I knock on the door, and she says, "Come in." I open the door, and she's looking at me with the strangest look I've ever seen. And then she bursts out laughing. And she reaches into her desk drawer and takes out a $5 bill and hands it to me and says, "It looks to me like you need a new shirt." And I looked down at myself, and I realized I was bare-chested. My shirt had been torn off, and it was hanging down in ribbons. She says, "Go home, get some sleep. We'll worry about it in the morning." So I came back in the morning, we did a report, and that was the end of it as far as McLean Hospital was concerned. But not for me. Because in the 58 years since, I've gone back many times to revisit that memory, to try to tease out of it the truth of what really happened. Who said what? What should I have done? What about Just a Dream? Everything that went on, trying to order it in the right way. But here's the problem. I have learned that every time you go back and revisit a memory, you change it, however slightly, not intentionally, but because of the processes at work in memory, such as confabulation and dissociation. So what I finally come to conclude is, I'm never going to know what happened back then. All I'm ever going to have is an ever-changing memory of a memory of a memory of a memory of a memory. As far as what actually ever happened out there, only God knows. Unless, of course, there is no God, and then nobody knows.
Back in the mists of time, when I was in my 20s, I worked at the London Zoo. I was assistant curator of birds, and together with my boss, we had offices above the tropical birdhouse that we shared with Desmond Morris, who was curator of mammals. From time to time, Desmond mentored PhD students that were studying mammals. And one such was a young man from Frankfurt called Rainer, who was studying the opposable thumb in primates. This was London back in the 60s. It was terrific. I drove an old London taxi, and I had plastic flowers stuck all over it, designed by my pal Mary Quant. I wore very short skirts and high white boots. So after a while of studying, Rainer started to bring me a single rose every day, and we became friends. At about this time, I had to go to the airport, London's Heathrow Airport, to meet a collection of birds coming in from Kenya, brought by one of our collectors, David Roberts. As David and I were watching the crates being unloaded from the plane, he was fishing around in his pockets and produced a small snake, not quite a foot in length. And he said, "This is an African python. I saw it as I was getting on the plane in Nairobi, scooped it out and thought you'd like it." I was thrilled. Back at the zoo, I went in to see the head keeper of birds to organize some mice for my snake to eat. And when he heard how small it was, he said, "You'll probably just need a medium-sized one," and handed me a cute little mouse. So when the python was, well, when we were in the office, I had the python in a large aquarium tank. And when I was out of the office, I wore him on my person. So this time I got the mouse and popped it in the tank and waited to see what would happen. Nothing happened. The snake didn't regard the mouse as prey, and the mouse, getting a bit bored and hungry, started to chew on the snake. So distraught, I grabbed it up, ran back to the head keeper and told him what had happened. And he took the mouse from me by the tail and whack, killed it immediately on the bench, on the workbench. I was horrified. Laughing, he said, "You're going to have to get used to doing this yourself." So when Rainer finally asked me out on a date, I knew what to do. I filled my pockets with baby mice. And we had agreed to meet on the steps of the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And as we went into the gallery, I said to him, "I'd like you to go to the men's bathroom immediately." Unsurprisingly, he wanted to know why. And I explained, and he laughed, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and hurried into the men's loo with my mice. But he was in there for such a long time. I paced up and down nervously in the hall, pretty much like I am right now. And men went in, and the same men came out, but no Rainer. Finally, he came out, somewhat red-faced, grabbed me by the arm, and hurried into one of the galleries where we could sit down. He explained that when he entered the bathroom, the stalls had been full. So he sort of loitered by the urinals, awaiting some solitude. The opportunity finally came, and he was alone and started smacking these mice up against the urinal, and just almost completed the task, wiping the last of the blood off the urinal, when he kind of got the impression he was no longer alone, and there were other customers of the bathroom looking at him very darkly. He hurried out with horrible visions in his head of tomorrow's newspaper headlines: German caught killing mice in National Gallery bathroom. Luckily, no such headlines ever appeared. I learned to kill the mice myself, and my relationship with Rainer continued splendidly.
When I was 5 years old, my uncle drove me to the mental hospital. "Why do we have to go?" I asked. "Your father needs you." "What's the matter with him?" Silence. In our family, we didn't talk about difficult issues. I just knew it was my duty to help my father. I didn't ask why my mother didn't go. I just knew I was her brave little man. Well, we pulled up to Camarillo State Mental Hospital. First thing I noticed was the windows. They weren't like any windows at our house. There were big bars on the windows, and they were painted a Pepto-Bismol puke pink. Now, it's not surprising that the 1948 movie, The Snake Pit, starring Olivia de Havilland, was filmed at Camarillo. And also the Eagles' mega hit, Hotel California, is reputed to be about Camarillo. I remember my father as being a strong, vibrant man. I remember we would go to the park and I would sit on his shoulders near our house in Sherman Oaks, and I felt we were a team. But the man I saw when we went to the hospital was not the father I remembered. He was always a small man, but he looked shrunken. His eyes were wide, he hadn't shaved, and there were particles of food embedded in the corners of his mouth. I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't. I visited my father every week for a year. Every week was an increasingly traumatic experience. I saw my father deteriorate under the onslaught of psychiatric drugs and electroshock treatments. My father suffered from bipolar disorder, as do I. But back then there were no treatments that were helpful. Now I can look forward to health and recovery. But I spent a lifetime trying to forget the horrors of Camarillo State Hospital and the anger I felt towards my mother for making me go. What kind of a parent subjects their 5-year-old child to a mental hospital? And why did she never go with me, not even once? But recently I've had a change of heart. I was going to the Ace Coffee Shop, pick up my new business cards. Nice.
I can't see that.
They say, Jed Diamond, PhD, helping men and the women who love them since 1969. Have you ever noticed that sometimes the universe delivers our life work way before we can embrace it or even understand it? I've come to realize that I've actually been helping men and the women who love them for nearly 70 years, since I was 5 years old. What a crazy, wonderful journey. Thank you, Mom.
I shudder when the day before I'm going to go on a trip, I get that email from Delta Airlines saying, it's time to get your boarding pass and sign on. And I'm like, no, my time to get my boarding pass is tomorrow night before I go on the plane at whatever 2-3 hours I have to be there. So this time the flight was close to midnight. The airport was pretty quiet, no one at the counter. But I still went up a little apologetically like I usually do because I'm not doing what Delta wants me to do. I went up to the woman and said, I'm sorry, I don't have all that app stuff. I need the old-fashioned paper boarding pass. And this time, the woman was not as old as I, but old enough that if she's worked there long, she remembers when we only had paper boarding passes. And she beamed and said, thank you. You have relieved the boredom of all the time that I've been watching these people run by with their cyber app, their cyber boarding pass on their iPhone. We had a good time. She said, well, why are you going to Dulles? Is it business or fun? And I said, it's a family wedding, not politics, luckily. And as I left, I was happy. I thought, appless, I had this happy conversation. When I got to Arlington after the wedding, I had another app experience. I went into Starbucks to order a coffee one afternoon and went to stand in line and wait for it, and I noticed this app line sign. And I thought, I think I've seen one of those in Cloverdale at the Starbucks. And I sort of put it together at that point and thought, I bet if I had an iPhone and a Starbucks app, I could have been rushing to my next important appointment, and I could have ordered and paid for my coffee from my phone, rushed into Starbucks, picked it up, and been on my way. But instead, I'm waiting. And I have time to notice this young lady there with one of those removable casts around her leg and ankle. And I said to her, I bet that's not really comfortable in this humidity. And she said, it's especially not comfortable because I just moved from Northern California. And I said, well, I live in Mendocino. Where did you live? And she said, Berkeley. But I took this wonderful job, and I think it'll work out, but I'm already missing California a little bit. And I pointed at her cast and I said, well, did you do that before the move or after? And she said, this silly thing, I did it 2 days ago on a date, my second date, with someone I met online. I was just being clumsy and foolish out on the dance floor. Luckily, he's not going to dump me as a clumsy oaf. I said, well, that sounds fun. And just then my coffee was ready, so I went and picked it up. And as I left, I said, good luck with your new adventure. That sounds wonderful. As I turned to go, she said, please say hi to California for me. When I got back to my friend's house, I said to them, well, have we heard from the newlyweds yet on their honeymoon? I was kind of surprised how regularly we were hearing about their honeymoon. I certainly never emailed anybody or talked to anybody on one of my honeymoons, but I didn't have an iPhone with apps. None of us did. So we're, kind of updated on this wedding. And so I said, oh, what do you hear? And they said, well, they're still in Portland, Maine, having fun. And I said, well, I hope they're having good weather. And all of a sudden, Christine said, Alexa, what's the weather in Portland, Maine? And I looked a little puzzled, and she said, you know, our Amazon tower out there in the kitchen. I'm thinking, that black thing on the tower, okay, and this disembodied voice said, it is 70 degrees and no clouds. And then I said, well, that's in, what about Mendocino? Alexa, what's the weather in Mendocino? 60 degrees and cloudy. I'm thinking, well, Alexa knows that much. And then my friend said, you want to play Jeopardy? I'm like, Jeopardy? Yeah, Alexa, let's play Jeopardy. And Alex Trebek comes on and starts the questions. Well, we had 3 college graduates in the room, so we got all 6 right. So we had this instant fun, and we felt pretty smart. So I have to admit, you know, it was all kind of fun as I headed home on the plane and got back to Mendocino. I was missing my friends, certainly missing the wedding and the excitement. So I was happy when a friend from the Valley called and said, Joni and I are coming over to the coast and we're gonna have lunch. Would you like to join us? And we're picking up Carrie. And I said, great, fine. So we chit-chatted, had our lunch. The minute the dishes were cleared, Marnie gets out her phone. And it's like right here, and she says, this is my new iPhone. And look at all this Facebook stuff. My friends back east are they're so outraged at Trump, and they're so clever. Look at these funny, and I'm like, I really can't read them, Marty. And I said, the only thing that bothers me is, I know he's a clown, but I just think making all these funny jokes and making Trump a joke is not helping the dire situation we're in. And I'm also thinking, you've got 3 faces here around you, and you're looking at cyber faces on your phone. I didn't say all that, but I was wondering about it. And I'm sure by now you are wondering how such a Luddite curmudgeon makes it in this world. But I'm afraid that I see it more as maybe I'm a canary in the tunnel who is pondering this incredible proliferation of AI and just starting to ask, what would it be like if we all ended up in that tunnel and it was dark and we couldn't see each other's real faces? But down the tunnel, we heard the voice of Alexa. And she wasn't so entertaining anymore, but was giving us orders.
You are on my mind, always on my mind. Oh, don't mind me. Hey, what's on your mind? Are you feeling open-minded tonight? I hope you don't mind if I speak my mind freely. Do you mind? Do I mind? Of course I mind. I mind a lot. I mind about most things, but what I mind about most is my mind. My mind has been obsessing about maintaining a sound mind into my advanced years, even sharpening my mind, or at least not losing my mind. My goal is to balance a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I mind my body, and for the most part, my body minds me. My spirit and my mind are in harmony. But my mind is another matter. My mind seems to have a mind of its own. I believe that age is a matter or a state of mind, but sometimes I'm of 2 minds, and one of those minds just goes blank. Nothing comes to mind. Sometimes my mind wanders. Sometimes my mind strays, or my mind will go round and round. Things slip my mind, or my mind is just like a sieve. I remind myself I have a lot on my mind. Frequently at night, I can't turn off my mind. My mind gets exciting ideas. Thoughts spring to mind, or a worry may prey on my mind. When I want peace of mind, I do mindful practices. I focus my mind. I mind my breath. And my mind soars, no longer a prisoner of my own mind. I become mindless and I mind less. Mind you now, I hope you don't mind taking a little test about your mind. How well do you know your own mind? Do you believe that out of sight is out of mind? Can you picture things in your mind? Can you read minds, or have you had your mind read? Are you a mastermind, or do you know any masterminds? Have you ever blown your mind on mind-altering substances? You don't have to answer. Have you made an effort to cultivate your mind? What is good food for the mind? Do you know anyone with a dirty mind or a mind in the gutter? Is it hard to get your mind on something or off of something? Do you ever have half a mind to give someone a piece of your mind? What do you do to broaden your mind? Have you ever exercised and stretched your mind recently? Do you ever play mind games? Do notions ever just cross your mind? Bear in mind that it's a terrible thing to waste your mind. But I've wasted my mind, and my wasted mind's had a lot of fun. My mind especially likes to play with words. Sadly, I have seen friends and family losing their minds. They can't keep things straight in their minds. Their minds become confused, or they just become absent-minded. Keep in mind that it is possible to have a meeting of the minds, and that you can be in one mind if you win hearts and minds. Maybe you can even mind meld. With the power of my mind, I know I can do anything I put my mind to. As a teacher, I challenge students' minds. I tried to open their minds, and I occasionally boggled their minds. I try to be mindful, but sometimes my mind is just too full. In my mind's eye, I still have a steel trap mind. When an image comes to my mind, I create a frame of mind, and in my own mind, I become a legend in my mind. I know it's all in my mind, and it's all in your mind, too. Our minds co-create our reality. I like to think that great minds think alike, and I've known a lot of great minds. I believe that keeping our minds open to all possibilities is one of our greatest challenges. I'm minding all the time. Thank you for letting me get this off of my mind. If you don't mind, we're going to take a 15-minute intermission right now.
Does she have equipment? Equipment? Oh, yeah. Oh.
There's a lake up high in the mountains and a solitary figure along the shore. A man alone with his fishing pole. A man alone with his God. My dear brother Mark. How I miss him. He was a kind and gentle soul, and troubled. Crazy sweet. He drove the airporter bus from Santa Rosa to SFO. If you ever rode on his bus, you would remember him as the driver who went out of his way to assure you of your arrival time. My brother was acutely aware of the stresses of flying. In a very personal way, Mark suffered from acute anxieties. He had a touch of our maternal grandmother's schizophrenia. To hear our mother tell it, it's the 1930s. And her mother has gone batshit crazy, chasing her around the kitchen with a meat cleaver. Finally, the guys in white show up to take her away, and our maternal grandmother goes to where she lives out the rest of her life at Bellevue, unable to recognize even her own children. Yeah, go visit Bellevue. Mark was fine throughout his childhood. Growing up as a teenager in LA, he had a bunch of friends and they had a penchant for partying. His fears first showed up in his early 20s. He started talking about conspiracies. The mafia was out to get him. People were loosening his lug nuts. It was crazy. The next thing we knew, he had met a young woman on the beach, and she introduced him to a Christian sect. He up and moves to Kansas to live and work with this group. They convince him to ride a bull to prove his faith in God, and he ends up seriously injuring his back. Then he ends up in Connecticut, all the way across the continent. We really felt like we had lost him. Eventually, he returned home to be near his mom and to get help with his ailing back. He moved up to Santa Rosa and he got his job with the airport. My poor dear brother had no friends, no love affairs. What he had on the front door of his apartment were 3 fat padlocks and a phobia for dust. Around that time, I warned him about a dark lesion that had shown up on his belly. He waved off my concern. He swore by his faith in God. He was deep into the Bible, memorizing passages word for word. Unfortunately, he was just as deep into his Marlboros. Anything to calm his poor nerves. He'd smoke those things down to the bitter end. With the passing of our parents, Mark got his inheritance, and he quit his job and he went on a 3-year extended camping trip. He would escape up into the high mountains, backpacking into these remote lakes, where he felt safe, completely away from people. His only friend, his fishing pole, and his Bible. We took a trip together, and we climbed Mount Whitney by the Mountaineers route, a crevasse up the east face. On that same trip, we met this family that was traveling the length of the John Muir Trail from Tuolumne Meadows to Mount Whitney. The parents with these 2 little girls, smudge-faced and courageous. I'll never forget Mark giving away our prized trout to that family as a gift on their journey. He was crazy sweet that way. Ultimately, he ran out of money and he became homeless. I did what I could. I got him a phone and I helped him get situated in a homeless shelter in Petaluma. He had to bunk in a dormitory with 100 other men. I don't know how he managed with all of his fears, but he did. He had found a way through his faith. He could minister to these others peace and comfort through the words that he knew from the Bible. Then came the cancer diagnosis, 4th stage melanoma. And Mark, at the age of 54, was gone. How I miss him. I think of him so often, and I have to understand from his death Don't sweat the small beans. Be happy with what I have. And above all, be kind and gentle with people. I'll always remember on our trip together, a thunderstorm moving in at dusk, the thunder roaring off the peaks, the lightning flashing in across the lake, and there in the dimness, my freaky brother grinning at me, chuckling. He knew fear, and he knew what it meant for us to confront our fears and ultimately do good. And out in the lake, beneath the surface, in the dark waters, the trout circling, forever circling.
In Cleveland. I was 16 and I burned my bra with that first women's lib group. And Richard Nixon was coming. I was going to demonstrate against the war in Vietnam, and I was taking my older sister Vera, and Mom said, whatever you do, don't get Vera arrested. But of course Vera was arrested too. And it was very frightening, handcuffed, thrown into a dump truck, having bodies piled on top of me. I thought I was going to die of starvation. And my home life wasn't really good. Was I going to wait for them to decide, am I going to be a juvenile delinquent or incorrigible? I hit the Ohio Turnpike, interstate hitchhiking. I wound up in Chicago. And I was really good at working hard for a very low wage, so I saved up a bunch of money, $35. I bought myself a car. And I got in that car, it was running, and it only ran 2 blocks. Wouldn't start. So I ran back, tried to find the guy. He was long gone. Saved up more money, this time $40. I was going to upgrade, and I was not going to buy a car that was already running. I was going to start it up. And it ran way more than 2 blocks. It probably ran 7 or 8 blocks. So I went back to the drawing board, and this time I saved $50. I was going to buy a good car. And that car ran and it ran and it ran for about 8 days. And there I am in Chicago, downtown in an intersection with a stalled out car. So what do you do? I don't know, you get out and you open up the hood, right? So I got out, opened up the hood, looked at it. Some guy finally came by and he goes, what do you think is wrong? And I go, I don't know. And he said, looked around, he pointed, he goes, I think it's the carburetor. And he left, another guy came by, he goes, what do you think it is? And I pointed, hey, I think it's the carburetor. Another guy came by, and hours, it was getting dark. One guy came by, and he goes, well, you got any tools? And I thought, well, maybe there's some tools in the trunk. I opened up the trunk, and there were no tools in the trunk, and he saw my jeans and my t-shirts and granola wrappers, and he had a really long face, and he goes, I'm a backyard mechanic. Let's say we just tow this car to my garage. And I was very grateful. We got to his garage, and he said, I even have a couch in the garage, I was doing pretty good, and I wasn't going to be a freeloader, so I cleaned up his whole garage before he got up in the morning, and I worked with him on all these cars. And then days later, we finally worked on my car, and we got it in tip-top shape. And it was getting cold, and all I had were these jeans and t-shirts, and I thought, I'm gonna go to Berkeley, California, where there's more people like me. And it's warm and sunny California. So, got $35 together, gas money, and I found this African-American guy, a hitchhiker, who seemed really nice. And he said, I have to deliver a package in St. Louis, and we looked in the map, and you can go the southern route. So I'm like, okay. And it was very late when we got to St. Louis. We delivered the package, and this guy, man, he was really thinking ahead. He had food, and he had a blanket. So, snuggled up with him in a park under his blanket. He was a perfect gentleman. And in the middle of the night, the cops stop us. And they're shining their flashlights in my eyes, and my phony ID said I have green eyes. And he's looking at my eyes, and he goes, but your eyes are blue. And I go, no, no, no. They're blue, but there's a little yellow ring in the middle, and you're shining a flashlight in the middle of the night, and in the daytime, they're green. And they just said, if you get out of town, we'll let you go right now. And so we got out of town. And my $35 for gas, it didn't last that long, and turned my jean pocket inside out, and I go, hey man, you know, you got any money for gas? And he saw that I was really telling the truth, so he started putting his gas money in, and we were only in Oklahoma, and he's like, well, we're almost out of money, what do we do? And I said, we pick up more hitchhikers. So we got hitchhikers, we went till we were almost out of gas. I pulled in the parking lot, I turned around, I go, hey, which one of you folks has some gas money? And they're looking at my guy, they're like, whoa, whoa. And he said, no. She spent all her money, then she spent all my money, and they're like, no, no, no. And he's like, you guys want to go to California? And they go, yeah. And they go, well, we're going to California. You put the gas in. So we got to California. You know, and I thought California was warm and sunny, and it's getting cold, you know, and I'm sleeping in the car, and I just had jeans and a t-shirt, and I was getting a cough. And over there at Shattuck and University, there used to be a Walgreens. So I'm in the Walgreens, and I have a cough, and I slipped a little bottle of cough medicine in my pocket, and I'm gonna go out to the store. And a little old lady in a trench coat, she goes, young lady, I saw you shoplift that cough syrup, you're under arrest. And I look at this little old lady in the trench coat, and I look at the door, and I look at the little old lady, and I make a beeline right for the door. And she shouts, stop, or I'll shoot. And I turned around, and she's got her service revolver pointed right at my head. I stopped, and turns out she was the captain of the police department. I'd like to tell you about my incarceration, but you know, I'm out of town. That's another monologue.
Sorry for the furniture moving. I'm the beginner here. Okay, that's better. The worst piece of news on climate change that I got this year came from the Lawrence Berkeley lab. One of their directors said, in response to the climate change deniers, but it's obvious, you can see from space that the atmosphere around the Earth has changed. It no longer looks like the blue planet that we saw for the first time 48 years ago today, 48 years and a few days. So I went for advice, and I asked, why haven't we seen you for so long? And I was told, we are not welcome as aliens, and it's not so much because of Trump. That was the only reason. As far as Trump is concerned, we're more concerned that he's going to unleash a nuclear war, and we put the Earth into the category of galactic danger zone. So nobody will come here because we're afraid you're going to blow us up. But we're watching. We're watching your fires, both from your burning forests and from your idiotic big cities that get lit up more and more every day. And we're very concerned about the craters you're creating on the Earth with your mining operations and your bombs. So we're just watching. I was told, though, that they're very concerned that nobody here seems to take any action to avert disaster. Well, there's one person who is really brilliant in putting her finger on capitalism. Naomi Klein tells us capitalism is destroying the Earth. And in a recent speech she gave in Santa Rosa, maybe you've seen it, in Q&A, she was asked from the audience, but if it's so terrible, why aren't we doing anything? Why aren't we putting an end to capitalism? And she had this moment of reflection, and after this little pause, she said somewhat under her breath, iPhones. And people in the audience said, what did she say? What did she say? iPhones. And then everybody laughed. The whole Veterans Auditorium in Santa Rosa laughed. In 1995, I began touring the big craters of the West. That was my goal. I wanted to see all these big holes in the Earth. And I had a beat-up old RV because I didn't expect any motels near these craters. And to my great surprise, most of the western craters are in or on native land. So it began with the Sandusky open pit gold mine in Fort Belknap on Assiniboine and Algonta land. I went to see the uranium mines of the Spokane, and down in New Mexico, Laguna Pueblo. I went to Big Mountain for the coal that affects the Dene and the Hopi. But the most holes I've ever seen on any native land are in Nevada, in western Shoshone land, because that includes the Nevada test site. And we sort of say, well, we only dropped 2 bombs in US history, but 569 more bombs were exploded on Shoshone land. And those are not the only holes, big holes in Nevada. There are the open pit gold mines that to this day are started. So in the early 70s, the Bureau of Land Management began confiscating the horses and cattle of the Western Shoshone sisters, Mary and Carrie Dan. And that's a process they continued into the early 2000s. They came and did raids, and most of the cattle were taken away and horses taken away. Many of them died. Part of the family ended up in jail. Unlike Cliven Bundy, who never spent any time in jail, at least not on the refusal to pay grazing fees on his cows in Nevada. Same BLM. the Shoshone Dan sisters said, "We're not paying you grazing fees, it's our land." When it continued, when the raids continued, it became clear that there was an ulterior motive. The Bureau of Land Management knew from geological studies that the Dan Ranch was on some of the biggest gold-bearing land, and the confiscation of the cattle were done to dispute the title and make them not survive, because that was how they're living. So I spent quite a few times there with them in my beat-up old RV. Each time I returned, there were more lights on the horizon because these gold mines operate 24 hours. And they create huge craters. You hear the dynamiting, and they pump water. Precious desert water gets pumped out, and then it gets mixed with cyanide, and that's how they recover the gold. So the pipeline mines were already there, and the last mine they were going to open was into the sacred mountain of the Western Shoshone, Mount Denebo. And that's the last time I was there, and anybody else was allowed to come near the mountain. So we were sitting there in the cold. People told me stories about how they used to go up the mountain and leave their prayers. And we looked at the juniper trees already having been logged. We looked at the drill pads where Barrick Gold Mine had ascertained that this mountain was sitting on gold. And we were sad, of course, and felt incredibly helpless, and there were very few white people there. And a circle formed in one of these tents, and somebody raised the question, remembered 150 years ago when Shoshone land was invaded, and when there was a treaty of Ruby Valley in which they never gave up the land. To this day, the Western Shoshone have title to most of Nevada, part of California, part of Idaho, but obviously seems unenforceable. And then somebody in this circle said, is there anything white society brought us that was good and helpful? And there was a big silence. People were really thinking. And one person said, oh, houses, we used to not have houses. And then somebody else said, but we got sick in those houses. They gave us creosote-treated wood for our houses. That doesn't count. And then there was a little more silence, and then one of the women elders threw these words down in their tent on the flanks of Mount Denebo, the last ceremony held. She said, toilet paper. So in the ultimate this is what it boiled down to. Western civilization. Who wants some? I mean, I do, since I heard that story, I do appreciate how often we all get to use it.
Hello, everybody. I've made some notes for myself because I'm old. It's like a little map in case I get lost. When I was a little boy, my parents took me to Sunday school. The teachers there told us all the usual stories, like Adam and Eve, the first two people that existed. and their eventual expulsion from the Garden of Eden because Eve, the first woman, wanted an education. And then their two sons, Cain and Abel, chronicling the first murder of one human by another, immediately after God showed favoritism to one of them. Then there was Noah's Ark. With this story, they emphasize always being good little girl and boys so that you will always have a seat on whatever rescue boat God may send your way, while he's committing genocide on a planet full of people to whom he gave free will and then got mad because they didn't do what he wanted. A lot for a little mind, much less very young emotions to take in, but they managed to introduce to us even more bewildering stories, like Abraham and his son Isaac, whom he was about to sacrifice to God at God's request. For the uneducated, he was about to slit his throat. With this story, they emphasize always obeying what you believe is God's guidance, even if it sounds scary or unreasonable at first. Believing all of this, and then there was, yes, Jesus dying on the cross, shedding his blood on the ground for our sins. There was something about it actually hitting the ground, reaching that point of no return that seemed very important to them. Kind of like a business deal that could no longer be undone. While they emphasized trying to be really good and not adding any more sins to the proverbial pile, they also explained that the sacrifice of Jesus was even more important than that, because without that, we could not be forgiven, no matter how good we tried to be. At this young age, accepting all of this really wasn't too far a stretch for me, because I'd already been heavily indoctrinated with complete faith and trust in other myths of the time, like Santa Claus. This jolly old fellow is very happy to bring presents to every girl and boy on the whole planet in one night. His only request is, just be good for goodness sake. For an entire year. Yeah, really. Then, the Tooth Fairy, who will actually give you money for used and even damaged teeth.
That's not true.
We have a smart one here. And then the Easter Bunny, this odd fellow, has a penchant for collecting hen eggs, colorfully camouflaging, and then hiding them everywhere, creating the unnecessarily stressful task for us kids to find every last one of them before they go rotten. Well, I found myself amassing quite a collection of what you might call questionable assertions. Someone today might call it alternate facts. Okay, I'm lost.
Alternate facts.
All right, again.
They're changing quickly.
Hey, I got a pulse. I'm old, but I'm happy I still got it. Well, anyway, after mulling all of this over for what seemed to be quite some time, because I finally was 7 years old. So about 7 years old, I asked my Sunday school teacher, why did Jesus have to die in order for us to be forgiven? She explained to me that Satan, that evil devil, had stolen us from God, and that God used the blood of Jesus to redeem us. She explained to me that redeeming meant to buy us back. So trying to make sense of it, I reflected the question back to her. So God gives the blood to Satan, and then Satan releases us back to God? No, she said, God is the one that requires the blood. Oh, well, it sounds to me like Satan is the good guy and God is the bad guy. She goes, how do you figure that? I said, well, since God is the only one who refuses to show mercy to anyone without first being paid in advance with the blood of an innocent, it seems like Satan isn't stealing us from God at all. He's protecting us from the one who is mean, hateful, angry, and spiteful. She said, no, God is love. God is the good guy. And I said, not the way you've explained it. Well, she assured me that the pastor would be able to explain it to me in a way that I could understand. Well, 3 weeks went by, and after many requests on my part, the pastor never came. He finally did convey his answer to me through my teacher, which was, I was too young to understand the deep mysteries of God. This was my first inkling that grown-ups lie about things they either don't understand or never will make any sense, not even to them. In the years that followed, I kept meeting gullible adults who were willing to believe very nearly anything, whether written down, asserted in a sermon, or conveyed with heartfelt emotion. Still not wanting to question any of it. Still not wanting to step outside the lines that had been drawn for them when they were very young. Well, it looks like I found my way. Because after all these years, what have I learned from these experiences? Only that growing, maturing, and evolving has very little to do with getting older. It has absolutely everything to do with being completely honest about the way things really are. Woo!
I'm sorry for reading this, but I had a hard time memorizing it. Sometimes one boyfriend leads to another, and another, and another, and so forth and so on. I was an ardent Catholic, a lay missionary, graduated from a Catholic college in Massachusetts, and teaching in Virginia in an all-black girls' school run by white nuns. During Christmas vacation, I returned home to my boyfriend, called him John, who introduced me to his good friend, Roland Blue. Blue was the name Roland had taken on after reading a book written in the 20s about a man named Mr. Blue, a man who in religious ecstasy spoke to God from rooftops. Now, Roland himself was not at all blue. In fact, just the opposite. He was sparkly-eyed, optimistic, ready for anyone, anything, daring to do whatever, be part of whatever was going on. When I first met Roland, his unbounding, deep religiosity swept me off my feet. Roland was just crazy enough to be interesting, and like me, he aspired to be a saint. I was spellbound. After I returned to Virginia, Roland and I corresponded, and during my spring vacation, Roland came down to see me, and just like that, we became engaged. The marriage to take place on that summer on the Feast of the Sacred Heart, a date on the liturgical calendar that was very important to Roland. And I was in religious ecstasy. When the school year ended, I took the train back to Boston, and Roland greeted me at the station holding a box of wedding invitations, garishly embossed with the flaming Sacred Heart of Jesus. That should have awakened my attention and embossed itself on my brain. But it was a short time later, standing with Roland in front of a fruit stand, that I finally began to realize what I was in for. Roland picked up a cantaloupe, got down on his knees, and looking up at me said, "If this was our baby's head, do you think you could deliver it?" I knew I was in trouble. My family confirmed confronted me later that day. We've talked to our people down in Rhode Island who know his family. That guy's not all right in the head. He's crazy. He's been in the nut house. You should not marry him. What to do? What to do? I sought advice from a good friend of Roland. The man Roland had picked to be the best man at our wedding. He said Roland was a great guy, and even though he'd been in a mental hospital once upon a time, it was nothing to worry about. Still, once my doubts had settled in, I could not shake them. By the end of the summer, that wedding was off. Roland hitchhiked out to California, never to be seen again. And guess what? That next summer, I did get married to the man who was going to be Roland's best man at the wedding. There he is.
When I was 18, I left home for college, and my father left home for the neighbor's wife. And our relationship ended. For 17 years, we chased wine and women down different paths. And somewhere along that road, his demons caught up to him. And his life became a daily routine of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. And when I got clean and sober, I decided it was time for us to heal. And so I took him to India to visit the places he had always wanted to see as a boy. And we gazed upon the Taj Mahal in the full moon. We watched the sunrise over the Ganges from Benares. We walked in the sacred gardens of Sarnath, where the Buddha became enlightened. And still, he clung to his routine of drugs to make it through the day. And so I decided we would head for the Tibetan monasteries in the Himalayas. And we boarded an air-conditioned bus with reclining seats and headed north. And somewhere in the early evening, we came to a fork in the road. And they put us down and they said, wait here for the bus that will take you to Pokhara. Well, evening came and went, and night fell, and no bus. And my father would not eat food from street vendors. And when he saw that the toilet was a hole in the ground with a cup of water, panic set in. And it was a very long night. The next day, an old local bus arrived. And we were jammed in it like sheep headed to market. And it got unbearably hot in that bus. And my father's anxiety rose to a feverish pitch. At the first stop, I got out and I talked to the driver. And he said the only alternative is riding on the roof. There's a luggage rack that is the width and length of the bus with all the worldly goods of the passengers piled on top and a cargo net over it. My father said, no way. And he went back in the bus. I climbed up on top of the bus and I felt like a king being carried into the Himalayas with the wind blowing in my face. At the next stop, I found my father under a tree refusing to get back on the bus. He was demanding that a taxi be called, and he would wait there until it came. I had the job of explaining that there were no taxis coming here. And I forced him up on top of the bus into the luggage rack and wrapped his arms in the cargo net. And he was like a scared animal paralyzed with fear. I tried to ease his fear. I told him how much safer we were on top of the bus. If the bus left the road, the people inside would be trapped. And I pointed down the 3,000-foot precipice to the river below with the rusted shells of buses and trucks in my car. Now his face drained of color. And he looked like death had just walked up and said hello. What I didn't know about my father is he'd suffered from vertigo his whole life. Now, each village that we went through, a few more men would join us on the roof. And after many hours, the luggage rack was swelling with men, and we were holding on to each other not to fall off as the bus bounced along gravel roads higher and higher towards the pass. And I don't know if it was the camaraderie or the shared danger, but my father came out of his paralysis and began to talk to the men around him and linked arms with them. And one man took off his cap and put it on my father's head, and my father became part of a tribe. And as the night came on, the men began to sing, and we huddled together for warmth against the bitter cold. And by the time we had crossed over the pass, our hands were frozen. But we were brothers on top of that bus. And when we got to Pokhara, we checked into a hotel, and we ate a dinner in silence and went to sleep. And in the morning, I found my father outside with his arms raised to the sky, staring up at the Himalayan peaks 20,000 feet above us. And when he turned, he had a smile from ear to ear. And he said, "Yesterday was the worst day of my life. I thought that you had brought me to India to kill me, and that was going to be my last day on earth." He said, "But I survived it, and I know that there will never be a worse day." And in his joy, he poured his pills down the drain, and we continued on our journey as father and son. The story is, it wasn't always easy for him. And so I hung a picture of that day in his office. So that he would remember the aftermath of the worst day.